Good morning, everybody. We are in the prologue of the Gospel of John, and yesterday, or in the previous lesson, I should say, we began just going verse by verse, trying to ask ourselves, what is this author doing to us as we read this text, as this text is structured? And we saw a number of very interesting things related to a Christological reflection on creation. That is, there are three creation stories in the Bible. There's Genesis 1, 1 through 2, 3 or 4, wherever it ends there. There's the second creation story in Genesis 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 through 11, which is kind of a mixture of two traditions. And then there's John 1. There are three creation stories. You have to understand this. The first creation story is not just a creation story, it's eschatology, because it has an end in it, this Sabbath, this rest, okay? And everything is good, and there's no blood. It's a non-sacrificial creation text. It's an extraordinary text. I have talked in my Entering the New Testament class in my mentoring group about the temple imagery and the creation narrative here. And this is all part and parcel of this, but we can't get into all that here. Well, in this business of creation, we have this whole new approach related to this structuring principle of reality, which is light, which is life, which is this figure that is face to face with God and is God, God's self-expression in a sense. And this reality is borne witness to in a human figure who's not named yet, but there's another figure that's named that just locates this thing right down in space and time, or what the Paul would say in Galatians, at the right time Christ was born of a woman born under Torah, and just zoom, localizes it. So now we have this historical figure in John the Baptist bearing witness to this light. We've seen so far that we could read this abstractly, but that's not what the writer's doing. He's becoming very, very particular. And then we saw that as you have the expression of this light and life, and you have this testimony to it in the Baptist, immediately follows the rejection of that light. Though the world was made through him, the world did not know him. That is the cosmos, that which we have structured. Cosmos has two meanings in the writer. One is the universe, cosmos, not the ktesis, creation, but cosmos. But it also refers to the way we structure our thinking and this broken reality that we live in, okay? That we can't extricate ourselves from. We can't. We need to be extricated from it. We need God in this sense. This is cosmos for us. I call it the matrix of religious violence, the matrix of sacred violence, the scapegoat mechanism, whatever you want to call it, however you want to label it. It's this cultural religious matrix that we live in. That's cosmos. But not only that, the writer goes on to say he came to his own. Now again, localizing this far more within a history, the specific history of a people, the Jewish people, came unto his own, and his own paralabon, passed him by, rejected him. This, my friends, is the first allusion to everything that this gospel's about, which is the cross, the rejection of Jesus. The entire Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, has as its theme this rejection of the light over and over and over and over again. But this writer is not the only Gospel writer that has to deal with this. Luke, when you go read Luke, there's a central section known as the travel narrative. It begins around chapter 9, verse 51, I believe, where you have little lessons on discipleship, and goes through middle of chapter 18. That section has no Mark in it. It's just what scholars call Q and L if they use sources or however they want to. But there's no Mark. It's just Luke. It's material in Luke, not found in Mark. Whether you want to say Luke uses Matthew, however you want to do it, it doesn't matter to me. The point is, you have this central section that not only, as Kenneth Bailey shown, has a wonderful chiastic structure, but David Mosner in his book Lord of the Banquet, about a quarter century ago, showed that this whole section is structured on the theme of the rejected prophet, Moses. How Moses and these themes of Moses' rejection by the people of Israel are echoed in this travel narrative as Jesus is set his face like a flint to Jerusalem in 951 and straight shot down to chapter 18, 19, where he's in Jerusalem now. There's this rejection theme that goes through this part of the narrative. You certainly see this after the feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of John, when the crowd wants to make him a king. And he comes and he says, okay, here's what it's going to look like. And it's a wonderful text if you examine it in terms of ancient kingship and sacred scapegoats and the relation between the two and what's being what we're invited to do in John 6. It's an amazing text when we get there. But everybody flees. There's a rejection of this. Now, you see in the Gospel of Mark, the narrative's framed as a cosmic conflict. And there is immediately, in chapters 1, 2, and 3, one conflict after another, beginning with the testing in the wilderness. There's just one conflict after another. There's a few healings there in chapter 1, and then bang, 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 bang. You get to the chapter 4 on the parables in Mark, and then bang, you're back in conflict again, and then you get to chapter 8, which is the big turning point. Again, after the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus wants to know, what in the world, who do the people think I am? And having to shift the disciples' thinking, or at least try to, he doesn't succeed. And one of the themes of Mark's gospel is how dense these followers of Jesus were. I mean, people that knew Jesus did not get him. You have to understand this. And getting Jesus is not easy. Okay? It's easy for us to pretend, had we been there, we would have understood. No, because we continually reject him as Christians. Christianity's thrown Jesus out. They've accepted a domesticated Jesus. They've accepted a cultural Jesus. They've accepted a religious Jesus. It's in the bosom of Christianity, Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, Anabaptist. It doesn't matter. Liberal, fundamentalist, it doesn't matter. He came into the world. That includes the church. The world did not know this Logos. The church is part of the structured reality. Again, this is a mimetic theoretical perspective, looking at the term cosmos and the term Logos as two very different ways of structuring reality. And the cosmos structures reality on rejection. And now we begin this theme in verse 12 and 13. And the writer says, but, and now you have this little adversative de, and now there's another side to this. As many as welcomed him in, opened the door, come in, showed hospitality to this Jesus. It says, he gave them, you can translate exousion as authority, right, sometimes as freedom, but not really, I don't think here, to become children of God. Gives them this authority. This is the authority I give you to become a child of God. To those who believe, and then you have the first occasion in this gospel of the phrase, in his name. And this will pop up over and over again, because you have to remember, for the early church, in Judaism, God has a name. It's unpronounceable. We don't say it. You know the letters, YHWH. We don't say those letters. We follow the Jewish tradition and we say Hashem, the name. Hashem, the name. We don't say the name. We say the name. And for the early church, in the ascension and session of Jesus at the right hand of the Father, as you find, for example, in Philippians 2, Jesus, the specific, is given that name, Hashem. Hashem's name is given to Jesus. There's that very clear identification at that point. And the author is reflecting this in the phrase, in his name. And he moves on and he talks about the birth here of these children, the right to become these children. He says it's not from blood or from human choice, nor from the choice of a male, to have an heir. None of this happens, but they are begotten of God. It is God that does this. We in Christendom are far too anthropocentric. We think the gospel is about us. It's first about God and the character of the God that engages us, because only the character of the Father as an engagement of us is a true engagement with God. Everything else is religion. Everything else is projection. Everything else is just anthropological, anthropocentric, in the worst way. And the writer's letting us understand here that the story, the gospel, God's spell, God's story, God's narrative, the gospel's about God. And we've got that reversed in almost all Protestantism in America today. Or we've distorted it because both liberalism and conservatism and Protestantism are Gnostic. And you can see Philip Lee's book, Against the Protestant Gnostics, Oxford University Press, 1987. Excellent book, never been refuted. And I think foundational for understanding American Protestantism and its incredible civ-like character and how it's completely sacrificial. Nevertheless, you move on in the text. This logos now, we're back to the first verse, second verse, the description of this logos, the structuring principle of reality. The logos becomes flesh and dwells among us. And we beheld his glory. Glory as a unique, beloved Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. I'll just translate it straightforward. First, just as as John 1 through 5 echoed Genesis 1, so these verses 14 and particularly 16, 17, 18 are going to echo Exodus 33 and 34, this covenant revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai. Remembering that this writer is rethinking the Jewish tradition, first the creation narrative and now the Exodus narrative, through a Christological lens, which does not mean finding Jesus there, but correcting the way these narratives have structured themselves and us. The word becomes flesh and tabernacles, eskenosin, skenao in Greek. The radical consonants, S, K, N, are the same as you find in Hebrew with the term Shekinah, Shekinah. The glory of God, his kavod, God's kavod. And here we have this tabernacle language with this glory language associated. And the word became flesh, and we beheld his glory. Glory in the Gospel of John. You're being introduced to this term in Greek and just secular Greek. The word doxa means opinion. It's someone's opinion. But in Hebrew, when God has an opinion, it's a weighty opinion. It's kavod. It's glory. And when this writer uses this term, if you are thinking of glory in terms of kavod, mystery, magnificence, this cloud of a pillar of fire by day and by night, and whatever it was by day, I forget. I don't pay much attention to those narratives, and I should. At any rate, you have here, in this historical figure, in this human being, you have this logos. This logos and this human person are fused. They're one. They're one and the same. The logos became flesh. Sarx. It doesn't say the logos became a man, you know, ho anthropos. It says the logos became sarx. Sarx is, again, one of these terms we translate as flesh. It's used for physical, you know, existence. It's also used for, in a similar way as cosmos is, to refer to this broken reality. Paul uses it that way, certainly. And I think the writer to the Gospel of John does as well. So sarx here, the word became flesh. The word enters into this broken reality. This new structuring reality enters into this broken structured reality that we've created, cosmos, and journeyed for a while with us. And we beheld his glory. Glory as the unique Son of the Father, is the not or unique child, the unique child, doesn't say son. Monogenes here, and Craig Keener has an excellent bit in his commentary on this if you want to read it, explains very simply, to translate this as only begotten is just to be under the influence of the Latin Vulgate, and there's no need to do this. This is not Nicaea, okay? For that, you would need a different term, monogenetos with a double nu. This does not come from monogenao with a double nu. It comes from monogenao with a single nu, which means one of a kind, unique, only. And it's used, for example, in Genesis 22, with regard to Isaac as the only child. Take your son, your only son, your monogenes, your only child. Your unique child of promise, certainly. And so that's how monogenes is used here. And again, how specific have we gotten? We have not only gotten very specific with regard to this individual here, this logos becomes flesh, but that this logos has a glory. We don't know what this word means yet, but there's something weighty surrounding this logos figure, this figure who doesn't have a name yet. And that glory is this, you could almost want to say, aura of being the unique self-expression of the Father. Notice this. This glory is full of karitos kai aletheos, grace and truth. This translates to Hebrew terms chesed and emeth, covenant faithfulness, and truth, true truth. Okay? We certainly recall in this gospel the use of this or its adjectival form alethenes with regard to so many sayings. I am the true vine, for example. You have covenant faithfulness here, karitos, and karitos, charis, grace. So that's why our translators say full of grace and truth. Those are kind of weak terms for us because we think we know what grace is and we think we know what truth is, and we don't have an idea of what either is. I've observed before that grace is where there exists no economy of exchange in a relationship. That is, the choice of the one in the relationship to be the giver and always the giver, with no expectation or requirement of anything in return. One gives because one gives and is a giver. That's one's heart. That's grace. That's the Father. And that's what we see in the Son. Okay, that's charis. That's grace. There's no economy of exchange. Now, this is going to become very important in a moment. So we have next, John bears witness concerning him and cries aloud, saying, this is the one of whom I am said, the one who came after me is before me, for he was first. And now this little slip in the narrative brings John's witness back in So now we have the second witness of the Baptist to the Logos. The first witness of the Baptist to the Logos is in verse 6. Now we have the second witness to the Logos here of the Baptist. This one who came after me is before me. He's prior. He's protos. He's first. And then the writer is going to say, this is the hymn would continue. So I'm going to read from verse 14 to 16, and we'll pull out that little narrative piece. The Logos became sarx and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his doxa. Doxa as a unique child of from the Father, full of charitos, grace and truth. For from this fullness, from his fullness, we have all received kai karen antikaritos. Grace in place of grace. That's a funny thing with the commentators. They look at this and they go, "Man, this is tough. We're struggling," because it's a phrase that they have a difficult time explaining. All the writer's really trying to say is, and if you understand this, that there's no economy of exchange in grace. This is what the writer's doing. Full of charitos, grace and truth, for of his fullness we have all received grace upon grace upon grace. That is there's, you can't think in terms of economies of exchange anymore. Grace in place of grace. I mean, if you have grace in place of grace, you don't have economies of exchange. You only have grace in the relationship. It's a relationship of covenant love and fidelity and truth. It's the kind of relationship the Father and the Son share. Now, so far in this text, we've noticed there's been a rejection of this light. We've noticed that this particular logos, the structuring principle, comes into this cosmos, and there is a witness, a testimony to this logos as a historical person, and that this logos recreates reality with charitos, grace, and aletheia, truth. Gracious truth, truthful grace. And then to conclude the prologue, the writer says, well, the law was given through Moses, and now we have it. Here we go. We are going to begin a theme in this gospel that is known as the Jesus-Moses parallelism. And in this gospel, one of the things that you have to recall, first century, late first century, one of the things that's happening with Christians who are still in the synagogues, that is, they're Jews, they worship in the synagogues, but they're Christians. And if they've, for some reason, had to kind of maintain a fairly secret identity, which appears to be the case, but they've been outed, and now they're being rejected by the synagogue, and that is part of the milieu of this gospel writer, and that is the thesis behind Lou Martin's work and others who recognize that there's this kind of thing happening in the background here. The contention has to do with the locus or authority of revelation. Where is revelation to be found? And of course, for Judaism, it's Torah and Moses. And it's difficult for those that don't study Second Temple literature to realize the archetype that Moses is and functions as in Judaism, in Second Temple Judaism. It's absolutely astonishing how revered he is. Samaritanism, surely. But you have here now this Torah, this instruction, was given through Moses. I believe it's in C.H. Dodd's interpretation of the fourth gospel. And he observes that every single assertion made about the Logos in John 1, except for that of John 1:14, the Word became flesh, but the other assertions at the beginning were made about Torah by the rabbis. That is, Torah exists in the beginning with God. Torah is in some sense divine through inspiration. All things are created through Torah and for Torah. God consults Torah before God does certain things. That's not necessarily here there, but it's true. You see this especially as you look in wisdom literature, where Torah and wisdom becomes fused, and wisdom becomes this handmaiden of God, through whom things are created, as in Proverbs 8 or the wisdom of Solomon. These themes are also fused here in the fourth gospel. They're part of this bigger background, and there is a wisdom tradition here that we should talk about, but my gosh, this text is too deep and rich, and I'm really trying to get somewhere with this as we move through this. So you have this Jesus-Moses parallelism, and the writer begins by saying the Torah came through Moses. Charis and aletheia, that is the two terms that were used in verse 14, full of grace and truth. That is, this Logos become flesh has this glory. This glory is full of grace and truth. And from the fullness of this glory, we've all received grace upon grace upon. You can't imagine life without economies of exchange. It's the writer's just trying to get you to begin to move there. So this Torah comes, or is given, I should say, through Moses. Grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. Now we have Jesus named for the first time in the narrative. And immediately upon that, we have an assertion about this Jesus Messiah. No one has ever seen God. Now again, hearkening back to the Exodus narrative, when Moses says, I want to see you in your glory, and God says, I'm going to hide you in the rock. Don't look back. You're just going to see my backside. That's all you get to see. And Moses, it's so incredible. Just even this little teeny shadow of a figment of a piece that Moses sees turns his face, sacred and lights up, and he has to have the veil and the whole thing, and Paul gets to play on that in 2 Corinthians 3. This is this notion. Torah comes through Moses, but grace, real covenant faithfulness, and truth come through Jesus. No one has seen God. No one has seen God. Then you have the phrase, the unique God, in some manuscripts. Other manuscripts read the unique Son of God, or just simply the unique Son. The editors in the third edition gave this a B reading. It probably does matter for stricter exegesis what's happening here. I think it can be interpreted still in a good Trinitarian framework. The point is, what the writer's saying here by using monogenes again with regard to Jesus, either the writer's asserting that Jesus Christ is God, or the writer's asserting that the unique Son, that is Jesus Christ, the one who dwells in the bosom of the Father, and that phrase is going to be used again in John 13 with regard to the beloved disciple residing on Jesus' breast. This unique Son is the one who exegetes the Father. Exegetes is the verb. We can translate it. It makes the Father known. It's more than that. Jesus is the exegete of the Father. That's who he is in his character. And now you have an absolute contrast, because it doesn't say God gave Moses the Torah. There is an implied subject here. It's a passive. The law was given through Moses. It doesn't say God gave the law. It says God had a self-expression, a logos, that became flesh, a historical figure known as Jesus of Nazareth, to whom John the Baptist bore testimony, who was rejected by the world and his own, But to those who received him, he gave authority to become children of the Father just as he is. And that's the theme of the gospel. It has nothing to do with how the evangelicals interpret it. Nothing at all. Because they haven't changed their way of thinking. They're still sacrificial. They haven't made the moves this writer's inviting us to make by living in a Trinitarian life. So now we wrap up the prologue and we note there are any number of mimetic elements here. There are certainly, as it were, prescient kinds of views toward what's going to be happening. You don't know this yet with doxa, which will begin to be redefined in chapter 3. But already the writer is going to be changing the way you think about what glory is. And so he's inviting you to come into this. Maybe you're thinking in terms of, this bright, brilliant manifestation that's easy to be seen. And the writer is going to say eventually, no, doxazo, to glorify, refers to this abject humiliation on the cross, this crucified criminal death, this awful, torturous experience where obviously God is not. And God was not there, but the Father was. God, small g, was not there, but the Father was. So that's 30 minutes. That'll take care of the prologue. We will begin our next lesson in verse 19 and begin our look at chapter 1. If you want to look ahead in this chapter, you're going to want to ask a couple of questions. You're going to want to ask, first of all, about what's happening. Why are there so many different titles being applied to Jesus immediately in this next section? Second, you'll want to ask about the relationship between in 150, 151, with reference to the ascending, descending. You're going to want to go back and look at the Genesis text of Jacob and Jacob's dream. You're going to want to ask about Ezekiel and the use of Ezekiel and Merkabah mysticism. If you're a scholar, Gary Manning has an excellent book on Ezekiel and Jewish mystical traditions and what the writer is actually reacting against when we get to that, I'll talk about ascent, religious experiences that in Judaism, mystical religious experience where you ascend a ladder, as it were, to the divine, very identical really to the entire Western Christian model of the ladder of monks or cataphatic spirituality or the charismatic, journeys to heaven, that, you find repeated ad nauseum going all the way back to the Hanukkah literature. And you see the influence of this, and we'll talk about that when we get there and how the writer's reacting against all that, because the fact is it's everything gets turned upside down here. And by the time we hit chapter 2, this writer has got our thinking discombobulated, and it's done on purpose. Anyway, wish you well. Hope you have a good time reading the Gospel of John with me. I hope it's been fun. It's been fun for me. Peace and love. Cheers. Till next time.